So 3 months ago, I talked to Ken Cloak about studying more mediation this year, and he agreed to help me out and give me a ton of suggestions, one of which was to read a few books. And of course, he's very humble and didn't want to recommend his own books, so he recommended a bunch of other people's, but I got him to recommend some of his as well. And so I ended up with these 6 books to read, and I thought, oh, okay, I'll read these 6 books in Q1 of 2024. Turns out I only had the time to really read one of them. I had to read a whole bunch of other books in order to prepare myself, and some of the books were super dense. So anyhow, what I wanted to do was make a sort of book review. I'm calling it this conflict transformation book review of each of these books. And this is the first one, and it's called The Third Side by William Ury. It's not really a book review because I'm not going to do the whole book justice. It's more of conflict transformation highlights. So let's go. What I loved about The Third Side. So first of all, if you don't know, now you know, William Ury is a legend. He was one of the guys that wrote Getting to Yes. He helped bring us this interest-based negotiation. So we went from the kind of old school market bargaining system of like, oh, I'll pay 10 dinars. And you're like, no, I want 90 dinars. And okay, I'll give 20. All right, I'll give 80. To meeting in the middle, which is kind of a zero-sum game, to opening the perspective of mediation and negotiation to a win-win. Be like, oh, you're fine paying more money, but you just can't do it now. Or, oh, you have like extra horses and I need horses, whatever it is. Expanding the dimensionality, the dimensions of it, so that there could be more potential for everybody getting what they wanted. And for me, what I really like is that it gives me hope, and it provides a very practical justification for curiosity. Because in order for this to work, you really have to know what the needs of the other party are, not just their bargaining position. So it implies relationship in my mind. So that's an advertisement for Getting to Yes. This is not that book. This is a book he wrote many decades later, probably. But the best part I like about this book, The Third Side, is just how real he is in the author's note. And I just felt, maybe it's because this journey of where I am in terms of my hope about what's going on right now. But he's a guy who's an anthropologist. He's a professional mediator and negotiator. He's just a legend in the field. And he starts out by saying, I'm concerned because the tribe I study is in danger. And I really like that. I like that gap in perspective where he takes a step back and sees us as one tribe and as a tribe that's in danger. And then his whole book is an answer to these questions that he poses in the beginning. You know, as long as I can remember, I've always wondered how we can get along despite our deep differences. And that's something that I'm really focused on, is not by avoiding our deep differences, but really by including them and going through them. And, you know, his conclusion is that our present challenge is to change the culture of conflict itself. So the infrastructure that's below all of our conflicts we're having. And it is to create a culture where even the most serious disputes are handled on the basis of mutual interest and coexistence, which of course is the philosophy behind Getting to Yes and that win-win idea, but really taken much more seriously, I guess, in this case. So he's telling us exactly what we need to do as a species. He's telling us exactly what we need to do as a species. And, you know, the rest of the book could almost be read as a justification for his hope. You know, it's trying to speak to the rational mind that has closed off access to hope and giving the people permission to try. And maybe that's the most powerful thing that would come out of it, is not the knowledge you learn, but the fact that, like, this guy has looked into this for 30 years and he still has hope. I mean, there are actually some really important practical points that he brings up from our history as a species that we need to, like, come back to, and that's what I'll spend most of this talking about. But so he starts off and he's like, hey, there's 3 reasons why peace seems impossible to people, why people have no hope. And then he structures the book around these 3. So the first is like, hey, when push comes to shove, there's no other way. Violence is king. So he addresses that. And then he addresses, oh, it's human nature. We've always been violent. We're always going to be violent. And then he goes to, there's nothing I can possibly do about it. So the book has 3 parts. The first is like, what is the alternative to violence? This is what he calls the third side. That's what the book is named after. The second is a history of human conflict, and he tries to show that violence is not human nature. And the third is instead of there's nothing I can do, here are 10 things that everyone can do to prevent conflict. So I'm going to spend most of my time on part 1 because that was the itch I had and it scratched it the best. And that is the idea that there is an alternative to war and violent conflict, and it's called the third side. And it's something that we can and do create in our society, but we can emphasize it and create it even more. But before that, I think there's something worthwhile, something fundamental and fundamentally challenging about his approach. So I want to highlight it. And it's something I see in a lot of my different studies of conflict resolution. And he says that also in his introduction, which is we need more conflict, not less. And so the basic idea is that conflict that's hidden is bad. And it's really better to have it out in the open so we can deal with it. And that the fantasy of eliminating conflict really just buries it and ignores it to everyone's peril. And so I think about a hat that I saw a few years ago. It's probably after the 2016 election. And it said, it's like in the MAGA style, Make America Great Again style. But it said, make racism wrong again. And I was like, oh, that's funny. And thinking about that now, the idea is that, God, it was just so great when we didn't hear much about racism or racist perspectives for a few decades. And I would like to go back to that. I think that's what the hat is saying. It was like safer for me when I didn't have to hear about that shit. But what William Ury is telling us, and what many of these people in the conflict world are telling us, is like, just because you don't hear it doesn't mean it's not there, and doesn't mean it's not affecting you. And the better thing to do, and the braver thing to do, and the harder thing to do, and the grimy thing to do, is to go into it and understand what's at the root of it, and what's what's legitimate, what's legitimate about the racism. Really, I'm just to go right to it. Like, what is true about what those people are saying, and what they're feeling, and why they're led to feel the way they feel. So our challenge is not to eliminate conflict, but to transform it. And that to me, it's of course dialectical synthesis, man. I mean, how can I ever get away from it? Dialectical synthesis. The challenge is not to eliminate it, but to transform it. So 3 parts of the book. I'm spending most of my time in part 1. This is the there is no alternative argument. And there's certainly a truth to that. We have bodies, we have physical violence as a tool. It is definitive. You can kill someone and they can no longer argue with you. It's generally not a great tool. We all know that, perhaps primarily because we're never really sure how it's going to end out. It's a really unpredictable tool. And I just saw this amazing documentary by Vincent Steger. It's called A Wolf's Journey. And it traces this wolf who migrates from Romania to Spain. He's kind of kicked out of his pack, and they have this amazing way of tracking and filming this wolf all across Europe. But anytime this wolf has the opportunity to get into a fight, he's incredibly circumspect. And it was really striking to me. There's a hedgehog, there's a bear, there's other wolves, even like a deer. But basically, anytime that there's even a small chance that the wolf protagonist could get hurt, he's like, not worth it. Because he doesn't want to win. He wants to emerge from the fight totally unscathed. And he will go hungry for days if he thinks there's even a small chance that he's going to get hurt. He's not going to tangle with a hedgehog. He doesn't want to get any kind of those like prickly spine bits, even if he knew he would win, just because he has no healthcare, basically. I mean, he's like a American in that way. Doesn't have good healthcare. Sorry, wolf. So, but the point, what is the point? God, was there a point? I'm sure there was a point. It's, most animals seem to avoid violence as much as they can. That's the point. And I get that. And it represents a failure of viable alternatives. Like, for me, it's like, it's the option of last resort. If there's no other viable alternatives in my mind, then I might do it. And whether or not that's actually objectively or rationally true, that there's no other viable alternative, is not anywhere near as important as just what happens in my mind. Because if I can't perceive another creative solution, then there's no alternative for me, even if there might have been objectively. So the most important concept in this book is called The Third Side, which is why they named it after it. And it's basically a society level institution for managing conflict. And the claim is that all societies have it. It's stronger in some than in others. And a lot of the book is him demonstrating from like other societies that he's studied as an anthropologist how strong it can be and how strong it could be for us. And the definition is basically, it's when the community shows up to a conflict to help transform the conflict into something useful, is what he calls the third side. So if this doesn't happen, the conflict can then spiral out of control. And the way that happens, according to Uri, is that the third side can prevent a harmful conflict. It can then resolve what cannot be prevented and contain what cannot be resolved. And he calls this a conflict management system. So he's got like awesome stories from people in different parts of the world. And a lot of his drawing on work with Bushmen in the Kalahari Desert that it's spelled ! K-U-N-G. I have no idea how to pronounce that. And then the Semai people in Malaysia. And both of these societies, and the reason he brings them up so often, is they feature a very active third side, or a very active civil society that immediately sees it as the most culturally important and appropriate thing to do, to intervene when conflict pops up. So they see it very clearly that their community is the natural container in which conflicts emerge between individuals, and it's fundamental to the prosperity of their community to intervene and transform this conflict into cooperation. So there's three different elements of how this works, and then we get into some of the stories. One is that the community does not take sides. So if there's a conflict between two people, the idea is not like, oh, I'm on this person's side, or oh, I think this is right. The express ethos is not to take sides. So I think this is very different than how we do things. I wonder if the right metaphor is at the level of the market system or the state, where these are, for us, these institutions are omnipresent. They totally affect how we do things. Our lives would be very different in every way if they didn't exist. And it's even just hard to imagine how we could get normal things like toothpaste if we didn't have the market system. But there are ways to do it, and people do it. And there are many societies that didn't have market systems. People still got what they needed. But it's just hard for us to imagine how we do it because we're so used to it. And of course, there's drawbacks to those systems, and there's drawbacks to market systems. So that's kind of beside the point. But I'm just saying it's probably as hard for us to imagine the significance and power of this social conflict management system as for somebody who doesn't have the market system to understand how we go about getting our toothpaste. It's just very, very, very different. So another way he talks about it, the third side, is as the emergent will of the community. So this, of course, means that there is a community, and the community is tight enough to have an emergent will, which I'm not really sure is the case in a giant democracy like ours in the US. And maybe it may not. And of course, it's very heterogeneous, and there's communities that do and communities that don't. There's diverse communities that do, diverse communities that don't. There's homogenous communities that do, homogenous communities that don't. But, the very fact that we have people from everywhere in the world with all the different religions and backgrounds and worldviews and Facebook rabbit holes means that the notion of emergent will is actually, it's kind of difficult to translate. But getting distracted, the whole point about the taking sides thing is that in a society with a strong third side, when a dispute erupts, it's the role of the community, the primary role. It's not to take sides, it's just to get everyone to sit down together, along with everyone that was possibly affected by the community and that they're deeply connected to, and to work out the problem under the witness of the community. So the idea is to bear witness. And so this is literally the opposite of taking sides. It's the opposite of having teams judging the participants. It's the society is just too busy physically getting people together to worry about that stuff. And in some of these examples, somebody goes around and removes all the weapons, because everyone rolls around in this society, in the Kalahari Bushman one, with these poison-tipped arrows. And so, like, somebody has a conflict, one person not involved in the conflict gets everyone, like, calls everyone together. It's like, all right, we're going to work this out. Everybody sits down in a circle. Another person goes around and picks up everybody's poison arrows and hides them. So very practical. And so there's just a ton of peer pressure for people to work it out and just not blow up everybody's scene. So there's another mechanism here that comes up frequently in the conflict resolution literature that I want to elaborate on. And this is the assumption that people only get to agreement through personal change. So the way I think about that in a modern mediation is that you come into a mediation or negotiation with a position, like, this is what I want. If it's a parenting plan, it's like, I want Jimmy for Christmas. If it's a divorce, it's like, I want $400,000 and the farm. And the only way that you leave that with a voluntary durable agreement that you're not going to just renege on tomorrow is that if you set with a different position you came in, so like, okay, I want something else, or okay, I'll accept something else, when you're not forced to do so by the law or by violence, is if something changed in you and you want something different. So, as Yuri says, in the final analysis, conflict is resolved largely through emotional, psychological, and spiritual work of the parties, which is what it would have to be ultimately if it's voluntary, right? And you can get two people in a circle, all their friends, and one person says, you assaulted my brother, you killed my animal, you stole my tractor, and the other person denies it or justifies it. And that's not going to resolve or transform the conflict, of course. But you only get progress when one of those people decides to be different internally, which requires them to see themselves differently and giving you permission to be yourself differently. So this is my kind of going on to my little interpretation of what Yuri's saying here is that people sit down and it's a bunch of people staring at you who care about you and encouraging you to see yourself differently and giving you permission, which will then allow you to forgive or apologize or admit what was really alive for you, which then allows the other side to do the same. So it's basically peer pressure. It's a community peer pressure structure that encourages us towards personal growth, which results in long-term peace in society. So that's the core. I mean, if that's the message of it, is like, hey, instead of being a society that encourages conflict, we can be a society that takes responsibility for not taking sides and creating a container that allows people to work out the conflict themselves. So the second feature of that, and I just hinted at it, is the belief that if there is a violent, disruptive conflict, it's actually our fault as a community. So as one of the people in the Semai people in Malaysia told Yuri, if something happens and you didn't intervene, you are accountable. You are responsible for the conflict. So that's like a very high bar of accountability. I was trying to draw a metaphor to what something we might relate to. And so this is what I was imagining. I was imagining there's a house fire in my neighborhood, or your neighborhood, sorry. And in which of these situations would you consider yourself accountable or responsible? So 1, you started the fire. I think maybe we could agree that you're responsible. 2, you noticed the fire and you added fuel to it. I would probably still feel responsible. 3, I'm an electrician. You're an electrician. You worked on their wiring yesterday. Clearly messed it up. High degree of responsibility there, I would say. You're an electrician and they asked you for help for free fixing the wiring and you said no, knowing it was dangerous. So you had an opportunity to help, but you didn't because you wanted to get paid. So in this case, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm responsible for that or not. I dropped 15 boxes of really dry old newspapers at their house the week before, maybe knowing there was electrical problems. I noticed the fire and I did not call them or 911. Am I responsible in that case? I evacuated my own house, but I did not help them put the fire out. So in these strong third side societies, my sense is that we would be considered responsible in all of these cases, which I think is different than how most people think about it now. So I think that's a really interesting difference to reflect on. You think about all the different conflicts that are going on right now and all of the time we spend defending or justifying one side or another, rather than using all of our moral force and funds and organizational capability in peer pressuring a solution. Pretty different. And pretty different because if we felt responsible for all of the results of all of the conflicts, we might act differently. That's the claim here, and I it lands with me. Okay, and the third feature, and this is something, of course, you're going to be like, oh yeah, of course, Ankh, you're going to highlight this because you love it. In these third side societies, people spend a lot of time hanging out. Apparently, in the Kalahari Bushmen, the Kung dudes, spend 2/3 of their time visiting relatives and friends. Not 2/3 of their after work, after kids' soccer, pre-bedtime time, but 2/3 of their waking time period. This is very different. But if you think about it, it makes sense for them. I mean, first of all, we have to remember we're talking about a nomadic hunter-gatherer society where adults spend about 18 hours a week on getting their basic material needs met: food, clothing, and shelter. So they have a lot more time than we do to hang out because they've organized their life so they don't have as much work to do, because there's not as much working for the man to get the flat screen TV because they're nomadic and the TV is too heavy to carry, and maybe there's not electricity or something like that. But more relevantly, if the major conflict management system in society is talking through everything with everybody present for as long as it takes, I would guess that those circles are really not that fun. It's like these kind of long consensus decision-making stuff that everybody hates. And I would guess that doing art and making jewelry and music and horsing around would be way more fun, which is probably what they're doing otherwise. So, like smart people everywhere, they realize that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and the best prevention is hanging out and getting on the same page with everybody else in the group. So, that's my understanding of the third side. Yuri's idea is that if we want to strengthen our conflict resolution systems and not have so much lame and murderous war all the time, we need to do those three things: more relationship building before a conflict, increase our feeling of accountability to conflicts around us so that we stop taking sides and start investing in the process. Those seem to be the basic steps that he's identified to preventing harmful and violent conflict. Note that doesn't address what happens later, how to resolve the conflicts that couldn't be prevented and how to contain the conflicts that couldn't be resolved. He does get to that little bit in part 3, but for me, like, part 1 is the best. That's what I'm into. All right, so I'll briefly go over the rest of it. So part 2, remember, you have the 3 reasons people say we're doomed to violence and mutual extinction. So one of them is there's no other way. That's what we just addressed. The second was it's human nature. And the third is there's nothing I can do. Part 2 is about this human nature bit. And it's an argument about how peaceful cooperation is more human nature than violence was. Though ultimately, of course, he concedes that both are present and have been present for a long time. So the thing with part 2 is that it's largely speculative. He speculates on what human society must have been like before written records and documentation. And he might be right, and I'd love it if he was, but it's just very hard to feel convinced because there's no written records or documentation. So, I don't know. But the story he tells is nice, and basically it's something like, we were all in small bands that were very close together and nomadic, and when there was conflict, it was dangerous to fight because we were so vulnerable, and if it was conflict over resources, the population density of humans was so low that it would just be way easier for one band to just go somewhere else and kind of exit the scene rather than try and fight over it. And when the agricultural revolution happened, all of this changed because there's more population density, more sedentary lifestyle, and it was worth it for people to fight over a specific area in a way that it wasn't before. I can go to, there's actually other way. Yeah, so he says, agriculture changed all that. It made it more of a zero-sum game because there was like these fixed areas that people wanted to be into. So also it had higher population density, so higher density of conflict, fewer opportunities to just leave because you weren't nomadic anymore, and this weaker third side because there wasn't as much mixing between groups and people were more codified in their relationships. I don't know, man. It's nice thinking, but like, who really knows what's going on here? But one thing I thought was kind of cool is that he talks about how the knowledge revolution that we're currently experiencing, I think it's his word for computer world, is just as powerful and transformational as the agricultural revolution was. And he thinks it'll push us back towards better ways of resolving conflict because we're getting back into a win-win system, just like we were in like a low population density hunter-gatherer society, and like we were not in agricultural society. So that's that. The TLDR is that he's positive. He's just hopeful. And, he sees most of our past as cooperation and most of our future. And this is just like a 5,000 year glitch in the matrix that we're going through right now. So I'm open to it, but nothing convincing in there. And part 3 is the part where he denies us any opportunity to say there's nothing I can do. And he gives 3 very clear roles the third side can play. And I won't go into great detail because each of these roles has many different books written about it. But it might be nice for you to hear these 10 words and maybe feel a subtle pull or some kind of recognition of like, oh yeah, that's what I do, or that's what I like to do. And so he breaks it down like this. There's, in a conflict, there's needs that need to be met. And so you could be like a provider, which helps people meet their needs. And this could be physical or emotional or spiritual. You could be a teacher because there's skills that are needed in conflict, and you could help people learn those skills. You could be a bridge builder. It's like introducing people to each other from different groups so they can cross-pollinate. Be a mediator, someone who stewards a process that the participants are in control of. You could be an arbitrator, which is someone who resolves disputes for people and has some authority. Be an equalizer, which is someone who levels the playing field so people at different power differentials can still work together and solve an enduring conflict. Be someone who heals relationships, the healer. Could bear witness to conflicts, and with the understanding that someone who is involved in a conflict, especially with the power differential, will be affected by the fact that witnesses are present. Be a referee, so when there is some kind of dispute, you can stay more in the safe zone than in the danger zone. And then, of course, a peacekeeper, which is, I think, the last resort, or of using this may be a Gandhian or a UN kind of thing of using violence or your body to keep people from engaging in violent conflict. So those are the 10 things he says we can do. And finally, I'll conclude with a quote from Lao Tzu that captures the thought that comes up again and again in every book I read about conflict resolution and every conversation with every experienced mediator and facilitator that I've had this year, which is dozens this year so far. And everyone is always talking about prevention as being way better than dealing with a shitstorm in progress. Prevention, prevention, prevention. I just hear it all the time. Let it be remembered. Here's Lao Tzu's version. Confront the difficult while it is still easy. Okay. That was the first Conflict Transformation book review highlights reel. Hope it was helpful.